welcome to the Last Fireflies podcast, in solidarity with all humans and non-humans dealing with climate chaos.
Hi everyone, you're listening to The Last Fireflies, and today we are talking about where we are now with the climate crisis, broadly. Today it's gonna be me, Em, Ani, and Robi. And Robi will tell us a lot of stuff.
Thanks. Okay, well, welcome folks. We are kicking off the Infospill segment of the pod. I'm Robi. In these segments, mostly I will be the one who will be ranting to you about different aspects pertaining to climate change. The idea of this segment is to give presentations about either key basic concepts relating to climate change and new research results which are maybe not yet circulating in the media or just not part of the common knowledge yet. My motivation for this is two-pronged. So first of all, clearly we are an activist podcast. We are talking to people who are coming to the issue of climate change not merely as a curiosity, but actually care about the planet and our future enough to do something, which could be just talking to your neighbors or your parents. We all know how hard that can be. With these short presentations, rants, whatever, I hope to give you some tools. First of all, for you to understand better in more detail what climate change entails, the process in itself, what are its consequences for different parts of the Earth system, and hopefully also give you some conceptual tools that you can use also in discussions with others, especially people who are neutral or skeptical, so you can basically tell them that their position is bullshit. So yeah, that's the basic idea. I thought that maybe it's good to start with the situation that we are in today, to give some information about the predicament we are currently in, and also set the tone for the rest of the podcast, which will be mostly grim, at least my segment of it. There's pretty often nowadays pieces of media that celebrate the fact that the share of renewables is growing very fast in the global energy mix, and that's a real thing, and we should be happy about it. At the same time, even if now many countries produce more of their energy demands from renewables rather than coal, still globally, the level of fossil fuel consumption has not peaked, which means every year we are still burning more and more fossil fuels. Well, that in no way is compatible with a livable future. And I think people are maybe sometimes not attuned to the fact that this giant increase in renewables does not mean, as of yet, a decrease in fossil fuel consumption. So how is that possible? Like mathematically, it just means that our total energy demand increases so much from year to year, even though we are producing more and more energy from renewable sources. The total amount just keeps growing so much that fossil fuel levels have not been pushed down as of yet. One additional bit of information which is also important is that China has installed in just the last year a staggering amount of solar energy. It's really like a game changer level of energy capacity that's installed. And because of this huge capacity growth of solar energy, it is maybe expected that the coal consumption of China will peak this year. So as of yet, this is not proven, it's conjecture, but it is significant because China is the biggest coal consumer on the planet as a nation, not per capita, but as a nation. And it does have a big impact if China's coal consumption will peak. That will potentially put us on a trajectory where globally fossil fuel burning peaks somewhere between the 2030s, 40s, somewhere like that. And projections are that this scenario will take us somewhere around 2.6, 2.7 degrees warming. So it's maybe not the good news that you've been hoping for, but let's just break down now a bit what this number means and where it comes from. So most of the projections that you hear, especially in the context of politics, so if you hear some numbers coming from the UN or the EU or from different countries, it's usually some kind of number produced by the IPCC. The IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. At the present, it's globally the most authoritative body pertaining to climate change. It was established sometime in the late 80s, if I'm not mistaken. And its goal is to give, from time to time, once every 6, 7, 8 years, an assessment about the state of knowledge in the field of global warming research, and to translate, usually that means a 1,000-page report, which nobody reads, but usually that's condensed into a longer report, which contains scientific details, and a very short policy summary, which is meant for official governing bodies. So if a EU state, for example, wants to create a plan for reducing its fossil fuel consumption, usually it will take information from the policy summary produced by the IPCC. So it's important to say that the IPCC is an authoritative body in relation to climate science research, but also it's anchored in the political world in the sense that it has to produce real actionable measures. So we can see from the start that makes it somewhat conservative. So if the research tells us that our house is on fire, they will not say that the house is on fire. They will give some actionable measures. Another reason why the IPCC is conservative is that it's based on the consensus in the field. I think here a point is wanted about how knowledge is produced in the mature field. Generally, you have hundreds, thousands of scientists working in an area of research, and someone publishes a paper on a bit of research, and even if the paper is sound, the methodology is sound, etc., it takes a lot of time until those results get integrated into the established pool of knowledge. So it takes other researchers to reproduce those results, to verify the methodology, and even after that, it takes some time just because we are humans for everyone to fully accept them. And so the IPCC, even from that perspective, is lagging behind the current cutting edge knowledge in the field, right? So it produces actionable measures on something that's already had time to become part of the establishment, as it were. So when we think about, if you want to find out what's the state of the planet, currently we both need to look at the IPCC and also look at some current research papers which are published in prestigious journals, are highly cited, have been published by prestigious scientists. And so again, the IPCC, for several reasons, produces estimates and an outlook of the world which is conservative.
In the sense that the IPCC paints a more hopeful picture, you would say?
No, I would not say that the IPCC's language is hopeful. It strives to be neutral in general so that it's palatable for politicians. But it's just things are becoming so bad that the neutral language is already the neutral language is saying the house is on fire. You can no longer put it in milder terms. So that's why the IPCC's language is also, starting to look like the house is on fire rather than it's all right.
Maybe also in terms of measures that they propose or that the governments and politicians would propose based on the IPCC news are kind of conservative. And historically, IPCC, I think it was with a language of less alarmist. But yes, in the last years, for sure, they realized also that the measures taken, even if the news were known since a long time, that the state of the world is not really going towards something good. the measures that were taken was really not enough. And I think that created the alarmist or more alarmist language of IPCC.
But do we call it alarmist? Isn't it realistic?
Yeah, that's a matter of language, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good point. Whether we should use the established language of alarmist, for example, in this case. What I can say is that because most of the estimates and projections that arise in climate science are not exact in the sense that they have usually a large interval of uncertainty. And that pertains to the fact that you're modeling a complex system, if you're talking about models, or if you're talking about the geologically historical data, like for millions of years in the past, it's just hard to get very accurate measurements through very indirect methods, because we cannot go back in time, sample the air, and then measure it in the lab, right? And because all of the estimates, all of the numbers come with confidence intervals, we are always talking about risk, not certainty, right? And then there is something for which the IPCC can be blamed, at least from my perspective. It's that they, knowing these numbers and how the situation is and what risks we face, they choose to put them in this mild, neutral language, which then influences how people view that risk, right? Because people are not scientifically literate to understand confidence intervals or like stuff like that, right? And so if you say this number or this projection means we need to panic, or whether it says this projection means that we kind of need to do something, right? Those two scenarios will produce a very different result in people who read them, especially politicians who are usually not literate at all in science. They just read the very short policy summary, right? And so I don't know what language you want to use, but I can just say that the language that we use, whether we put the same thing in one form or the other, does influence how we perceive that risk associated to that process, to those numbers. So yeah, I've mentioned the IPCC because it's an important entity. And throughout this podcast, we'll be using language which originates in the IPCC. It's just because it is everywhere and it's a common language. Maybe one aspect that's important is that the IPCC gives this kind of general representative scenarios. There are a few scenarios which they associate like with the kind of business as usual, or then reasonable governments doing reasonable actions to mitigate climate change, and then rapid actions, etc., etc. And these have this kind of fancy name, either SSP, Shared Socioeconomic Pathway, or RCP, Representative Concentration Pathway. They mean the same thing, it's just a different name. And so, as I said, with this progress made by China of increasing its solar energy capacity this year, we are expected to be on a path with peaking fossil fuel use around 2030, 2040. This is coherent with the IPCC scenario called SSP 3 or RCP 4.5. I'm sorry for this whole alphabet soup of language. But again, it's a pathway in which emissions peak sometime in the mid-century, and then they start declining. This scenario takes us somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees, with current estimates of emissions as of 2024. It would seem that we are going towards 2.6, 2.7 degrees warming. It's a confidence interval, so that it might be 3 degrees, it might be 2 degrees, but certainly not less than 2 degrees.
You mean 2.7, 2.6 over what we have now? Or like, can you give more example of what that number is?
So usually global warming is given as degrees above the estimated value before the Industrial Revolution. Now, in practice, usually the baseline is taken to be some kind of average temperature in the period 1850, 1900. In that 50-year period, what are our estimates? It's hard to have accurate data, but usually that's taken as a baseline. And so in the present, we are somewhere around 1.4 shortly going to be at 1.5 degrees warming above that pre-industrial baseline. And as I said, the projections say that we'll likely end up somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees, but with some caveats, major caveats, which I will explain at the end.
Can we just go back to the time when there was a time when they said we should not go over 1.5, right? And then what happened?
That's a very good point. What happened to 1.5? Well, I would say that the 1.5 was not realistic from the start, but to clarify, the 1.5 is given by scientists as a threshold below which we do not expect major irreversible consequences to be happening due to climate change. Above that, we can expect already major changes, right? So the 1.5 came from science, and politicians realized that for that, we actually need to do like some really drastic measures. So what they do is something called pseudo action, which is they organize from year to year all these kinds of conferences, the COP, Conference of Parties or whatever, in which they talk and they come to no conclusion. One major this kind of conference was the Paris Accord in 2016, where they agreed. It was clear that 1.5 was very hard to obtain, so they agreed to keep warming below 2 degrees and strive to keep it below 1.5, right? But of course, as of today, most countries are not even on track to respect their pledges that would take us below 2 degrees. So all of these international conferences and whatnot, they are just pseudo action to make us think that politicians are doing something, while in fact allowing them to continue, well, them in cahoots with major fossil fuel companies to continue pillaging the world, basically, and our future with it. And to go deeper about this point of 1.5, it is really hard to believe that this current capitalist system can take us on that trajectory from where we are to a world where global warming is halted below 1.5. And this is like a very fundamental thing about capitalism. It's just, of course, this is a conjecture at this point, and we will explore it more in the podcast, but it just seems, in our understanding, that capitalism cannot contract in that way to take us from point A to point B. It's nice to say it in words and potential policies, but there is no continuous line taking us from point A to point B. For a more detailed discussion about this aspect, I would refer us to, and if I can make a self-plug here, to my discussion on the Lenashix podcast, of which I'm also a host. And we had a discussion with comrade Sinan from the organization Climaximo from Portugal. They are also a radical climate group, and I would refer readers to go to listen to that for more details. And now, just to end this line of thinking about the IPCC, I just want to add one more way in which I would say that the IPCC is failing us. So these kind of scenarios that they elaborate, I mentioned this SSP3, for example, which seems to be the emissions curve on which we are going, although this is not sure, because, emissions curves are also political. So with the ascent of the far right, we do not know what will happen, right? Because the far right is very friendly to fossil fuel consumption and fossil fuel companies. And we see with Donald Trump's second term now in 2025, it's chaos. But even assuming that emissions are going to go on that curve, which the IPCC says, I think representing risk again is misleading, because that curve already entails in its elaboration in itself not only current emissions, but future emission reductions due to policies, right? Different policies. So when we hear in the news that some country maybe has eliminated subsidies for coal, for example, is phasing out coal, right? Then we may be thinking, oh, that's nice. Then we are going on a scenario that is better than what has been discussed so far. But that is a lie, because or not lie, but that is misleading, because those cuts have already been foreseen in the IPCC scenario. So those cuts are the ones that will take us to 2.6. We will need to have something drastic, radically drastic, to happen in order to put us on a better trajectory than 2.6. So I think with this observation, maybe you are starting slowly to drift towards my point of view that we are truly fucked unless we act now. I think I would end the discussion about the IPCC with that.
Okay, so what can we possibly be happy about? What should we be seeing to be able to be hopeful?
Well, again, we would need to have something very drastic happen, at the least to have fossil fuel emissions, all emissions in the whole economy cut by at least with 50% by 2030. I think that's a goal we as activists should hold on to. To minimize risk, we would need that to be net zero by 2030. That would be the least we should hope for. But more strongly, if you want to avoid catastrophic consequences, irreversible changes, collapse of ecosystems, extinction of many species, we need to have, I would propose in 3 years, to completely remove fossil fuels from the energy production sector, and by 2030 to reach net zero globally. That's we are talking about globally, because then justice aspects come into question. Because people from the global north, right, the developed west, etc., they have higher historical emissions, higher current emissions, especially the upper 1/3, 10% of the people in terms of income. So, they would be needing to cut emissions faster than the global south. So then we are really seeing that the timeline really collapses onto nothing, 1 year maybe, if you want to give a number. But again, I think that even the milder deadline of 2030 to have 50% reductions is not possible within the global capitalist system. Again, this is conjecture at this point, but I strongly believe this, and we will explore it in future episodes. Just to reiterate it, I truly strongly believe that the dynamics of the capitalist system do not permit that kind of shrinking of the economy that we will need in order to get to even 2 degrees, hopefully 1.5 degrees. And now we get to the truly grim part, right? hold your seat, because only now do we really get to the really, really grim part, which is that this kind of projections that lead us, for example, we had this number 2.6, they take account only the processes which are well modeled in climate models as of today. As a shorthand, we can think of it this way. These temperatures are a consequence only of the emissions. X amount of emissions lead to Y number of degrees Celsius. And we are talking about in Celsius because fuck people who work in Fahrenheit. Sorry, that's a personal grudge. Right. But besides this direct effect of emissions, we have all different kinds of feedback mechanisms. So that, for example, if you have a warmer planet, ice melts, and then because there's less ice, the Earth reflects less heat back to space. And then there's an additional warming effect to that. That's called the positive feedback. Or, for example, most of you maybe know the issue of the permafrost. As temperatures increase, the permafrost, which is the frozen Earth around the Arctic Circle, starts to melt, and that releases also methane and CO2. And so you have all these kinds of feedback processes which amplify the actual warming that you have for the X amount of emissions. So in reality, we might expect a larger temperature than these projections give. How large? It's really not clear yet because we don't know all of the feedback mechanisms. But that's why it's important to talk about other processes too, besides the direct warming effect of greenhouse gases. So, as I said, one of those effects is these feedback mechanisms. A different kind of dynamic is that some elements of the Earth system have this kind of tipping point behavior, where if you take them to the brink, then they, start evolving by themselves. For example, if you want the temperature up to maybe 1.5 degrees, the Greenland ice sheet will start to irreversibly melt. Then no matter what we do, it will continue melting until it melts completely. So that's kind of a tipping point behavior. And if you consider these feedback loops, these feedback mechanisms, you have a kind of avalanching effect where X degrees of emissions lead to melting, which lead to more melting, which lead to more melting. And it's hard to estimate what is the final real amount, right? So this is just one kind of way in which the IPCC projections still underrepresent the risk of catastrophic climate change. Exactly how much do these different processes impact how the Earth will actually look like under our emissions scenario that we are in? Well, on one part we don't know, right? Because there's still research to be done. But as far as we know, we will explore that in the upcoming Infospill segments on future episodes.
Okay, I would want to mention something that we did not touch upon, and we will surely do an episode at some point about this. But I think it's important to consider, because you mentioned capitalism so much, just how are all of these things affecting people unequally, right? I really feel the need to at least mention the fact that the emitting countries are not the same countries and nations and peoples that are going to suffer the most. And the places that will become uninhabitable are not the ones that put out the most emissions, right? So I think that's really important to keep in mind when we look at climate change, and I like that climate chaos, and understand that it is inextricably political. And also, I would just underline that, yes, these places that will be uninhabitable, they will probably uninhabitable for non-human animals as well, and that there's also the sixth extinction going on, and that will also be something that we will touch on. And maybe just in case people are not super familiar, maybe can you just shortly explain how this warming 2.6 or 1.5 numbers appear? They mean averages, right? They're not something that you can measure in a day.
Yeah, well, first of all, they are projections into the future, right? So the maximum temperature will be reached at some point in the future, maybe in 50 years, from a given amount of emissions. But more to your point, this is the difference between weather and climate. So weather is just exactly what the weather is doing in a certain day. So it can be windy, it can be hot, it can be cold. But when you're talking about the climate, we are talking about long-term averages, right? So on average, how hot a place is or cold a place is, on average, how much wind or how many storms, or what's the average length of heat waves in that place, right? And it also means that even the average can be different in different places. So some places can experience almost no global warming in 50 years, and other places will experience a very, very large warming. For example, for 3-4 degrees global average warming, some places like the Northern Africa and the Middle East might experience 6 or 10 degrees warming regionally. So the regional effects can be very large. And also adding to your point, the places that will experience the most warming are already the places that experience the most political instability due to different reasons. And I don't want to be reductive here. We are talking about Northern Africa, we are talking about the Middle East. All those places will probably become uninhabitable to humans, or likely become uninhabitable to humans under a business as usual scenario.
I mean, all of this sounds awful, and I'm sure many people already know this. But just to add just a little bit on the awfulness, I would underline that I don't think it's fine at all for people in the Western world to feel in any way, more protected, because heat waves do happen in Europe and the United States and other places as well. And obviously, we should all feel responsible and like drawn towards action. This is what we should be feeling.
Yeah, I mean, things are looking pretty grim, and it is really my hope that this Infospill segment is not something that leads you to despair, right? But I would hope rather that, like the whole podcast, will give you tools to organize in some way. Like in the Infospill segment, we hopefully get some theoretical, conceptual tools. In other segments, tools for how to deal with all these strong emotions in our communities, and in organizing sections about how to organize to do something, because the outlook is grim, but at this point there is still time to do something, and I hope that mobilizes people and it doesn't lead them to doomerism.
Yeah, so this is like some sort of future making. It's a very small parcel and part of making a different future.
Yeah. I really hope that that's what we are doing with the podcast. Okay, well, to close out the section, I would just try to give 3 bullet point summary of what we've been talking about. So first of all, according to the IPCC, it seems that we are on a path towards a 2.6 degrees, 2.7 degrees warming world compared to the pre-industrial baseline. Then the second point is that the emissions curve that takes us towards this presupposed future, even this is questionable if it can be achieved under capitalism. And the third, that even if this curve is achieved, the actual warming that we will experience might be much worse due to different kinds of unaccounted for effects. And I've mentioned positive feedback loops and climate tipping points, which are not well modeled as of yet by the IPCC. And so with this, I'll leave you with a teaser for the next episode, where we will talk about climate tipping points.
This podcast is autonomously organized. You can support us on Patreon if you have like $1 extra in your pocket today.
So today's offering is a series of questions and a sort of an exercise. So if you have a pen and paper next to you, that would be nice. But even if you don't, you can keep it in your mind and just write it down later. So what we were thinking after all of this pretty grim stuff is to go towards something that's more tangible, and that is a Venn diagram. So this Venn diagram is proposed by Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, who is a marine biologist and conservation strategist. And it's really easy. It's just 3 questions, so it's just 3 circles. And what she proposed to sort of unfreeze people, right? And to give people more options for what they could do to participate in the struggle against climate chaos, is to look at these 3 things. So one of them is to ask yourself, what are you good at? What are your areas of expertise, right? What can you offer? That's the first one. Then second, what work needs doing? Are there particular climate and justice solutions that you want to focus on or that are available where you are? And 3, really important, what brings you joy or satisfaction? So what keeps you going, right? Because this is a long fight. It's gonna take our whole lives. So if we focus on these 3 things, then each and every one of us can find something that we're good at, that keeps us going, and that needs to be doing. So it can be like a lot of things. The point is to just find something in your neighborhood, something in your city or your village. Maybe it's something at work. And you can keep finding these sorts of things all the time. So obviously for me, at this point in time, for me, one of those things is doing this podcast right now. And maybe Ani and Robi can share what would be in the Venn diagram for you.
Well, for me, I would say, as is maybe apparent from the fact that I am the one mostly talking on the Infospill segment, is that I am a researcher. I love to work with data. I love to read papers, to interpret nice diagrams and plots and create them. So I think maybe this kind of technical knowledge is something that I can particularly bring to the climate movement, at least in my part of the world, where it's maybe lacking to some degree. Now I'm talking in radical circles, not mainstream climate movement. And also it brings me joy. So with this, I would tick the bubble 1 and bubble 3, right? It's really the bubble 2 that I've been struggling with, how to connect what I've put in bubbles 1 and 3 to what needs to be done, how the skills that I have can be put to good use, considering what are the needs of the local movement, but I don't know exactly what those are. So yeah, it's a question mark for me, bubble 2.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think what work needs doing is actually one of the most difficult ones because, climate podcasting is nice, but I don't know if it's the most urgent thing to be doing. Still, I think it's necessary. It is, but it's not something that's maybe the most urgent. But then again, I don't know if working with the most urgent thing is the smartest thing always.
Well, I would say that for me, the most important category of things to put in bubble 2 are things that help grow the movement. So I would hope that our work with the podcast does fit into that, right? But I think this is, like maybe compared to other countries in the West, movement building is even more acutely important here in like the Balkans, Eastern Europe, just because the climate movement is so small here. And yeah, I think working on this podcast does contribute in this direction, hopefully. At least this is what I tell myself.
Okay, I'm sold. I'm sold on that one.
Yeah, well, I personally think I'm the best at chatting. I like to chat. I love to chat with people. And I used to say about myself that I'm good at networking and bringing people together and make communities. So I think that's the thing I want to bring to the table usually when it comes to any climate topics or more other social topics that I want to work on. And I think it's nice to look at this simplest thing that you can do, chat with people, because from chatting with people around and bringing them together around the same round table and actually discuss about this exactly 3 questions that you put in this diagram, like you say bubble 1, 2, and 3, like what are you good at, what work needs doing, and what bring you joy. So these 3 together, I think if you discuss it with a collective or like a group of people, can bring way more than actually just doing it for yourself. So I would add that it's nice to do this for yourself and then bring those answers, as we do now on the podcast, to more people. And I'm not sure about how urgent, where do you start from? But bringing people together, I think, is the one little thing that we can do all.
That's true. I love that. And I want our listeners who feel like it to also share what they found out from the Venn diagram in the comments. So that's an invitation for you, dear listener. But like if you don't want to share it in the comments, do something even better and share it with your friends and your community, because that's maybe even more useful.
If you would like to support our work, you can do that by interacting with and sharing episodes on social media and subscribing to our YouTube channel. And if you would also like to help us financially, you can do that by subscribing to our Patreon or with a one-time donation to Ko-fi. As you know, in recent years, there has been quite serious legal crackdown on climate activism in Europe in general, and also growth of the far right in many countries, which are very fossil fuel oriented. It's becoming harder and harder to do climate activism, especially in places where the movement is very small and hasn't reached the critical mass, like Romania. This has been very difficult for the growth of the movement. With that in mind, we imagine this project also as a redistributive project. As we said, the members of this collective are involved in the climate movement in Romania in one way or the other. So the earnings from this project will go first of all to provide a part-time income for some of the members of the pod, which will allow us to do more work and take more rest in organizing. And after a certain threshold, we both like to redistribute this money to climate groups and individuals doing important work on climate change in Romania and the Balkans and Eastern Europe. And even supporting us with a $2 subscription in this effort would mean a lot to us. Thank you very much for listening and hope to hear you later and see you on Patreon.